Svetlana Alliluyeva and what became of her? Rosemary Sullivan will join us to talk about her new biography, Stalin's Daughter.
Apparently when he got into a rage, it was only she who could calm him down by wrapping her little hands around his boots.
What is the mathematics of mathematics, and what does it have to do with baking cookies? Eugenia Cheng will tell us about her new book, How to Bake Pie.
I've discovered all sorts of ways of explaining it by telling stories, and especially by talking about food analogies.
What's Judd Apatow reading these days? In a podcast first, we'll talk to the subject of this week's By the Book.
I'm always reading books to find out why my kids are either crying or yelling at me.
Alexandra Alter will tell us what's going on in the publishing world. Greg Cowles has bestseller news. And we'll let listeners weigh in by answering some of your questions for the editors here. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Rosemary Sullivan joins us now. She is the author of a new biography, Stalin's Daughter, The Extraordinary and Tumultuous Life of Svetlana Alliluyeva. Rosemary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
So what drew you to the subject of Stalin's Daughter?
This is my fifth biography, and actually three of the previous four had been about women. When I read Svetlana's obituary in the New York Times, it ended with a quotation from her in which she said, "No matter where I go, to an island, to Australia, I will always be the political prisoner of my father's name." And I thought, my gosh, what an extraordinarily resonant phrase, and how intelligent. So I read her work. I did know of her defection in 1967. I knew there had to be a lot of mysteries, and then I contacted my brilliant editor, Claire Wachtel, in New York at HarperCollins, and it was a go.
How much research did you have to do approaching this? Because you're not a Russian scholar. You're a biographer and a poet and a short story writer and many other things.
It was about 3.5 years of work. I had been to Russia for the first time in 1979. So, in fact, I knew the atmosphere, and like people of my generation, had grown up on Mandelstam and Solzhenitsyn and Akhmatova. So the research really was first archival, as always, and with that wonderful legislation you have, freedom of information, I was able to get the FBI files, the CIA files, NARA files, excellent files at Princeton and Yale. And then it was a matter of going to Russia. And through a contact in Canada, I reached the Alliluyeva family and was able to interview Stalin's grandson and other members of the family, and also to visit the archives in the Soviet archives, the National Archives, to see the letters of between Stalin and his 7-year-old daughter, Svetlana, which is a very uncanny experience, I can tell you. And in the course of the research, I interviewed about 40 people.
Okay, let's go back to Stalin. How many children did he have?
He had 3 children, Yakov from a first marriage, who was about 17 years older than Svetlana, and then a son, Vasily, who was 5 years older than Svetlana and Svetlana. So he had 3 children.
She was born in 1926. What was her childhood like?
It was schizophrenic, frankly. On the one hand, she called it that golden time, because in the Kremlin, despite the massive starvation that was occurring in Ukraine and elsewhere in Russia, of course, domestic life was reasonably benevolent, though even the Kremlin leaders had, theoretically anyway, rationed food. But endless friends, relatives visiting, grandpa and grandma, and this wonderful dacha in Zubalovo, which was her favorite place. So the first 6.5 years of her life were almost idyllic.
And what was Stalin like as a father?
I think he was an actor as a father, as he was with many people. The wonderful Yugoslav writer Gilov said that there were so many Stalins, so that he could be, on the one hand, the loving papa. Her mother, it would seem, was a kind of committed disciplinarian and rather cool with Svetlana, and it was Stalin who showered her with the tobacco kisses and all the affection she needed. And apparently when he got into a rage, it was only she who could calm him down by wrapping her little hands around his boots, So on the one hand, he was the loving father. He taught her always, never ask, always command. And she used to write little letters to him as first secretary, saying, "Dear Paposhka," and so on. And he would respond, "Your loving Papa, first secretary." Sometimes he called himself the poor peasant. So on the one hand, as I think Khrushchev put it, sometimes you thought it was the relationship of a cat to a mouse. But as Svetlana grew older and became a young woman, Stalin's control started to exert itself, and he completely and continuously disapproved of her.
Why did he disapprove of her?
I think because she was becoming sexualized, as we do as young women. You know, he would order her to wear baggy pants, and her skirt was too short, and she was lippy. And then at the age of 16, she had one of those romances that only a 16-year-old can have, those fantastic obsessions of the mind. A platonic affair with a very well-known filmmaker, Alexei Kapler. And somehow Alexei Kapler was imprudent enough to actually become involved as the imagined lover of Svetlana. So they used to take walks in the park, her hand in his pocket, and so on, meet at the art gallery. Stalin knew about this because he had taped conversations of Svetlana's, and she always had a guard. But when Kapler had the temerity to write in a newspaper, a public newspaper, a kind of love letter to his lover in the Kremlin, that's when he was sentenced to 5 years in the Gulag.
And was Svetlana aware of that punishment?
Absolutely. Her father, for the first time, actually called her, a nasty name and slapped her and said, your Kapler is a British spy. And so she understood immediately the implications of that. When Kapler was arrested, of course there was no mention of Svetlana or of Stalin. He was supposedly had contacts with foreign journalists. But you can imagine both the humiliation and the guilt that Svetlana felt. Her father said, "Just look at you. He has so many women. Who would want you?"
Svetlana went on to marry 3 times?
Actually 4.
4. And she had children in three of those marriages?
Yes.
What happened with those marriages, with those children?
In 1944, as the war was at its climax, really, she married a school friend, Morozov, and her father didn't approve. He refused ever to meet his son-in-law, nor did he ever meet him. He only saw his grandson, Joseph, about 4 times. Svetlana always thought it was because her husband was Jewish. It was a marriage she backed into on the rebound from her longing for Alexei Kapler. It was a marriage of friendship, the kind of marriage that normally doesn't last. Then she married again because her father wanted it. She considered it a marriage of dynasties. She married Yuri Zdanov, and that marriage, again, only lasted about 1.5 years. She had a daughter, Katya, whom Stalin only met once. And apparently, when he saw her, he laughed because she was a little pixie. When Svetlana defected in 1967, it was a spontaneous act of outrage at her treatment by the Kremlin. She felt she was being treated as national property. And I really think it's not fair to say that she abandoned her children. Her daughter was 17, her son was 22. When she landed in Switzerland waiting to enter the United States, I think she read Dr. Zhivago and began to think that she hadn't really understood that she would not see her children again. Her second daughter, Olga, was American-born. She was the daughter of Wesley Peters, whom Svetlana married in 1970. But she did have another marriage in there, which was a religious ceremony and really didn't count. It was to the son of her aunt and uncle, whom she had so loved, Alexander, and his wife Maria Svanitze. And I think she married Svanitze because he had spent so much of his childhood in orphanages and then later working in the Gulag, as a compensation out of a kind of guilt and a longing to resurrect a decimated family.
How would you describe her personality? What kind of person was Svetlana Alexeyeva?
I would begin by saying she was extremely intelligent. She spoke 5 languages. She was politically uncannily shrewd. I guess from all those evenings she sat as a child at her father's dinner table with all the Politburo members, listening as they discussed politics. She was remarkably compassionate, unusually trusting, given what must have been the internecine, difficult world of the Kremlin. I attribute that to the foundational affection she received from her wonderful nurse. She was impulsive. She could get angry, as I would say only a Russian can get angry. And when you were on the receiving end of her anger, you would think that she was ripping your skin. So I think Svetlana ran the spectrum from difficult, willful, prideful, compassionate, generous, intelligent. She was just a bit of everything.
Did you like Svetlana?
I admired her. I admired her stamina. I couldn't believe that given the sequence of tragedies that she had, first in the years in the Soviet Union and then later in the West, the United States, England, her return to Russia, I couldn't believe how she could keep bouncing back, that will to survival. So I admired the dimension of what a friend of hers called spirituality in Svetlana. But she would have been very scary to know because you would have had to have been so careful not to hurt her. A friend said that Svetlana had one skin less than the rest of us.
Her life was so eventful and so many ups and downs, and we can't go through all of it, but I want to leave listeners with the fact that she died under the name of Lana Peters, nearly destitute in Wisconsin at the age of 85. It's a fascinating biography. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
The book again is Stalin's Daughter, The Extraordinary and Tumultuous Life of Svetlana Alexeyeva by Rosemary Sullivan, reviewed this week in the Book Review by Olga Grushin. Alexandra Alter joins us now with Notes from the Publishing World. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So what's new this week?
So this week, the Association of American Publishers released their sales data from 2014, and there were some interesting trends. A lot of things are continuing, like we've seen. Children's and young adult books showed really strong growth again with a 20% increase in revenue. This was for 2014, of course, when everyone was freaking out about John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, so that might have been a contributing factor.
The movie, not the book.
Well, I think the movie really drove the book sales.
Right,
yeah.
The movie, and thus the book.
And thus the book. The children's fiction category outsold adult fiction in terms of unit sales, which I thought was rather interesting. And there was also really strong growth in digital audio, which was up about 30%. Ebooks grew a little bit, just by 4%, which is striking when you think back to a few years ago when they were growing by triple digits and people were predicting that by now the market would be at 90% digital. So we're seeing it sort of plateauing.
I'm not going to say I told you so.
And paperbacks were up. And finally, the thing that really jumped out at me, there was a new category that they were tracking for the first time this year, and that's ebook subscription services. These are services like Oyster and Scribd that are often called the Netflix of books. The model is basically $10 a month for all you can read. And these services have been, growing, and at first publishers didn't really want to make their books available. They weren't sure if it would devalue books, but gradually they've started joining on, and particularly with their backlist books. And so far, the data that's emerged has been pretty modest. It looks like publishers brought in about $13.5 million through subscription services, which amounted to something like 1.9 million ebook sales. And publishers basically register a sale if a reader reads a book on a subscription service. So that's pretty small.
All right. But by and large, some good news there.
Yeah, it looks pretty stable, and there's modest growth, and I think things are picking up. They also track retail channels, and physical bookstores were doing well in the past year. So that's also encouraging.
Let's leave it at that.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexandra. Judd Apatow joins us now from LA. He is known primarily for lots and lots of movies that many of you have seen, but he also has a new book out called Sick in the Head, Conversations About Life and Comedy, and this week answers our very difficult by-the-book questionnaire. Hi, Judd.
Great to be here. It was difficult to fill that out. It took me a month.
What was the most troubling aspect?
Reading Bill Hader's and Bruce Springsteen's and being so impressed that I thought I was dumb and started hating myself.
Bruce Springsteen's was really good, wasn't it?
When does he have time to read a book? He's on stage for 6 hours a day.
That's right. And then Bill Hader, also one of the best. You picked out the best people and then and compared yourself with them.
I knew I had to just be honest about the fact that I have never read a book. Then I was okay as soon as I embraced that.
Speaking of honesty, I think that there's a line in your By the Book that's already gotten a lot of attention online because I think a lot of people feel this way. You say that you've actually convinced yourself that buying books is the same as reading.
Exactly. In my head, it's like magical thinking. I think I've read it by buying it. And, everybody's like me, I think, where you have all of these books and you think, I'm going to get to them one day. One day I'm going to have so much downtime, I'm going to do Infinite Jest, I'm going to do some Norman Mailer, and it's not going to happen. I now know it's not going to happen, but I've convinced myself that I've already done it.
So when you were answering this, were there writers that you knew that you wanted to somehow, no matter what the questions were, work into your answers?
Well, I'm a big fan of Dave Eggers. I feel like his work's been very inspirational to me because some of it is very funny and it's dramatic and brutally honest. And at a time in my career when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to write, for the movies and television, I read his first book, and it just changed the way I was looking at what I was doing. So, and I work with him on fundraising for the 826 literacy and free tutoring centers that are around the country. He's someone that I'm always inspired by. And then I love Dan Schoen. I love all of his books. Among the Missing was the one I mentioned, which is a great book of, very unique short stories. I like people, even if they don't think they're funny, I like people that I think have a slightly off sense of humor. And so I'm always attracted to people like that.
What was it about heartbreaking work of Staggering Genius that attracted you, that you thought, I want to do something like that?
It just felt like he really opened up in a way that I was afraid to in my own work at that time. It took me a long time to realize the more you share with people, the more universal it becomes. And even though everything is ultimately fabricated for the most part, you do have to open up emotionally in your work. And when you're a comedy writer, for a long time you just think about comedy and nothing else, just jokes and getting laughs. And so it took me a long time to educate myself about storytelling and what it takes to connect with people.
When you think to where you were in your career at the time that you read that Dave Eggers memoir, is there something that it fed into in particular that you were working on at that time?
Well, I read it before I did all of my movies. But it was before I did The 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up and This Is 40 and Funny People. And, so it had a big impact on, how I was thinking about how I wanted to approach my work. And, there's all sorts of people that I love that I mentioned. I love that John Ronson book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, because I'm on the internet and I'm close to saying something that will end my career at any moment.
It's going to happen to us all.
So I found that one to be fun. And this book, Teenage Brain, by Frances Jensen, I mentioned, because I'm always reading books to find out why my kids are either crying or yelling at me. And so any book that explains that your teenager's brain is not fully baked yet and explains why they have no impulse control always brings me comfort through the tears.
Do you share that information then with them to help explain?
Oh, yeah, I scream at them. I'm like, your brain is not baked. It won't be baked till you're in your early 20s, so this is why you're being crazy right now. My kids are awesome, but I do live in a house with all women, and I've lost all my masculinity as a result.
Well, the brain question brings me very natural segue to your new book, Sick in the Head, Conversations About Life and Comedy. Tell us about this book.
When I was 15 years old, I wanted to get involved in the world of comedy, and I didn't know how to do it. One summer, my mother was a hostess at this comedy club on Long Island, and I met some of the comedians, and I was trying to figure out a way to get them to talk to me. And so we had a radio station at our high school, and my friend Josh Rosenthal used to interview bands, and this is around 1983, so he'd go interview REM and people like that. And he said to me, you should interview comedians. And I started this radio show, and I would run around and interview people like Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, Steve Allen, John Candy. I did about 50 interviews. I think I aired about 6 of them because I didn't really care if anyone else heard them. They were just an excuse for me to ask comedians how they did it. It really was my college education. And so for years I thought, I should put them out in a book. And one day I was talking to Dave Eggers, and I said, maybe we could put them in a book and give all the money to 826, and I could do some new ones. So I took all the interviews I've done over the years. Sometimes people interview me. Sometimes I do like a panel where, like I interviewed James Brooks at a panel with Larry Gelbart one night, and I transcribed everything, and then I did a bunch of new ones with people like Chris Rock and Lena Dunham and Louis C.K. and Amy Schumer, and I put them all in this book, and I think it's the book that I wish existed when I was a young creative person and I wanted to talk to people and ask their advice.
It's kind of a guidebook, in a way, to becoming a comedian.
It really is, but it's also about life and the struggles and the experiences that make you want to be a creative person. So it's not just about comedy. It is me checking in with a lot of friends saying, how are you doing? Why did you start doing this? How are you doing now? Are you still fulfilled? What are you trying to accomplish at this point? So it's both an emotional interview as well as a factual one about comedy.
Who was the first interview in this book that you included?
The first interview I put in is Jerry Seinfeld. I interviewed him in 1983. At the time, he was a comedian who would be on the Merv Griffin Show or the Tonight Show. And I just thought, this is the funniest guy ever. But, there was no Seinfeld TV show. There was no sense even that he was going to do something like that. He just seemed to be, the greatest observational comedian I'd ever seen. And he was from Long Island like me. So I felt like, I'm kind of like this guy. So that interview I put in first because I literally said to him, how do you write a joke? And he, step by step, talks through how he writes jokes using examples. And he was very nice to me, even though I was like a little kid showing up at his door with a tape recorder from the AV squad.
How old were you?
I was 15.
And how did you convince him to talk to you?
I would lie to everybody. I would call people publicists and say I was from WKWZ radio on Long Island. And I never said I was a kid. And, publicists would just set up interviews, and then I would show up as a snot-nosed little kid, and there would always be a moment when they would open the door and they would look so bummed, like, this isn't real. But then they would do it anyway because they were all so nice.
So among these early interviews you did when you were 15, also Sandra Bernhard, how did you come across her work?
Well, she was on Late Night with David Letterman all the time and was in my favorite movie of that era, King of Comedy, the Martin Scorsese movie. I met her at a restaurant in New York one day. She was a really hilarious person to talk to, but especially hilarious because I was just like a child, and she was a force of nature. It was very nice of her to talk to me, but that was when I was scared to talk to her because I was just such a gigantic fan of what she was doing, and she was also, very bawdy and a little scary.
She had this line in Confessions of a Pretty Lady that I remember reading in high school, where she said that she was walking down the street picking her nose one day, as she often does. And I was just shocked, stunned that someone could admit that.
Yeah, she was a very bold comedian, still is. She's just one of the legendary people. I included it because, there is like a very kind of clear line between, her work and the work she does today to like what Lena Dunham and Amy Schumer are doing. They are people are breaking down all sorts of barriers in comedy.
The way you organize the book is interesting because it's alphabetical, which I guess makes a certain kind of sense, but it really mixes in the interviews that you did way back in 1983-84 with the ones that you've done in the last few years.
Well, I tried to do it in categories, and then I was never happy with how they stacked up. And so then one day I said, what would it look like alphabetical? So we looked at it alphabetical from their first name and then their last name. And then we realized, it just kind of flows better alphabetically. But I always thought of this as a bit of a bathroom book. Every interview's 10, 15 pages. It's meant to be read on a plane or on the toilet. And I mean that in the best way, because that's how I spend most of my time in my life. Someone was talking about reading the book, and I was like, you don't read it like a book. It's got like 30-something interviews. You read it occasionally here and there. You don't blast through this 500 pages in a couple of days.
Did your interviewing style change between 1983, 84, and the current batch?
Well, I'm sure it did. I was such a terrified child at the beginning, and I think you can tell when you read the book that I'm so blown away that Steve Allen's going to sit down and talk to me. But it's different now because if I sit with somebody like Louis C.K. or Roseanne or Jon Stewart, most of these people I know a little bit or a lot, and I can have the type of conversation with them that a journalist can't, because there's an element of shop talk. But also, for some of these people, we're friends, and we can just check in on each other and say, how do you do the Daily Show?
Right.
How do you do that every day? The show's so amazing every day. How is that possible? And why are you not burnt out? Like, why doesn't the quality drop? I personally just want to know for myself, as someone that gets burnt out and is always trying to keep the quality high. So even when you're friends with people, you can't grind them about their process or about their personal life. But if you're writing a book, you can ask them all the questions that you'd be afraid to ask at dinner.
One interview just jumped out because you did it twice, Gary Shandling in 1984 and 2014. How different were those interviews?
Well, very different. And what I thought was interesting, both with Gary and Jerry Seinfeld, who I did an updated interview with, is in the first interview, they talked a lot about what their dreams were for their careers. And Gary, talks about wanting to do something in television. And so it's interesting to read what they thought they were going to do, and then, 30 years later, talk to them after they actually accomplished it. And Gary Shandling could not have, mastered everything he was hoping to master. He made some of the best television programs of all time with, it's Gary Shandling Show and the Larry Sanders Show. And so it's just fun to see the perspective of someone looking forward and looking back.
You're obviously an accomplished interviewer. Was there anything that you wanted me to ask in your By the Book interview about your reading life, the books that shaped you, that I didn't ask?
That's a very good question. What did I want you to ask me? I'm going on the road. I would want you to plug my road gigs. We're going to be at Massey Hall next week in Toronto with the Trainwreck Tour. And we're going to do the Wiltern and the Beacon Theater. And we're going to be in Chicago performing, me and Amy Schumer and Dave Attell and Colin Quinn and Mike Birbiglia and Vanessa Bayer. And all the money goes to charity. So I would want you to ask and let me plug it. Okay, thank you for doing that.
Excellent. Judd Apatow, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Eugenia Cheng joins us now from London. She is the author of How to Bake Pie, an edible exploration of the mathematics of mathematics. Hi, Eugenia.
Hi.
So this is a not necessarily easy to understand title or subtitle of your book. Tell us briefly, what is it about?
My book is about mathematics, and it's explained via food, specially aimed at people who would not, perhaps, otherwise like to read a book about mathematics. I know that many people are afraid of math, or maybe they used to like math and then they somehow hit a ceiling and then decided, oh no, it's not for me anymore, and went off in a different direction. But I believe there are many people who are curious about it and who maybe slightly regret not following up anymore or not understanding more about math. So this book is for all of those people and plenty more, I think.
You're an academic mathematician. What do you specialize in? What kind of math?
My speciality is category theory, which is a particularly abstract branch of math, and you might think that means it's very difficult to explain to non-mathematicians. However, over the course of years of going to parties and talking to my friends about it, I've discovered all sorts of ways of explaining it by telling stories, and especially by talking about food analogies. And so I decided to write this into a book so that I could reach more people that way.
So what do baking and math have in common?
Baking and math have much more in common than most people think. Baking is about taking some ingredients and putting them together in more and more interesting ways to make something delicious, or maybe sometimes not so delicious. But if it's not delicious, then you try again and you make something more delicious. And although there are some basic rules and recipes you can follow, it gets really fun in the kitchen when you start making things up for yourself to see what will happen. And actually, math is like that as well. Unfortunately, at high school, it's taught more as a set of rules that you just have to follow, and I found that a bit boring myself, so I sympathize with anyone else who found that boring. But then it turns out that at a higher research level, it's much more about making things up as you go along, taking basic mathematical ingredients, putting them together in more and more complicated ways, and seeing what happens. And it's that process that I found particularly exciting when I finally got there after all those years of passing exams. And I want to show that to everyone else. Even if you didn't pass all those exams, I would like everyone to be able to share in that fun and exciting and beautiful part of math.
So what can baking tell us about category theory? Can you explain category theory to us through food?
That is the whole point of my book. Well, not the whole point, but it's one of the points. The first half is explaining math through food, and then the second half I start explaining category theory, because category theory can be thought of as the mathematics of mathematics. So first you need to know what I think mathematics is really, which is not just the study of numbers and equations. It's more about understanding how things work. And so category theory is about understanding how mathematics works. And it's a bit like when you're cooking, first you need to understand how ingredients work, but then you can get one level more abstract and you can start understanding how the recipes themselves work, which means you're in a much better position to make up recipes for yourself.
Are there recipes in the book?
Every chapter starts with a recipe, and the recipe is there to introduce the idea that's behind that chapter. So every chapter, many math books have a chapter about different subjects, but mine has a chapter about different ideas inside mathematics. Because category theory is more about ideas and ways of thinking, I present mathematics as about ideas and ways of thinking as well. So each recipe produces some idea. For example, there's a recipe for puff pastry, which introduces the idea that just from a very small number of really basic ingredients, in this case flour and butter, if you do something complicated, you can make something really fantastically delicious. And in fact, you can make a lot of different types of pastry just using flour and butter. So with the same ingredients, everything is in the technique, and then you can produce different things. And just like in math, it's a lot about the technique, not just about the thing you start with.
One of the things I loved about the way your book is organized is that you start off with some math myths, which I think many of us hold. One myth, math is all either right or wrong.
Yes, that's a very common myth. And some people say that to me when I'm grading homework or exams. I'm going, oh, it's so difficult. And everyone says to me, isn't it just easy? It's just right or wrong. But it's not like that at all, because although it can be wrong if you make a logical falsehood or come up with a contradiction, there are lots of different ways of doing math. At a basic level, if you're just adding things up, it's right or wrong. But then at another level, you're building structures. And just like if you're building a building, it's not really just about being right or wrong. Yes, it can go wrong. If your building falls down, that probably counts as going wrong. But even if your building doesn't go wrong, there are all sorts of different ways in which you can evaluate a building. And that's true about math as well, because higher math is about constructing logical arguments, which are a bit like buildings because they're structures that need to hold up. And there are lots of different ways of constructing a logical argument, some of which are more efficient than others, some of which are more elegant and beautiful than others. And yes, we do talk about elegance and beauty in mathematics. So it's not all about right or wrong.
Why are people so afraid of math? Why do they get turned off by it?
I think there are many reasons for it. I think the fact that it's often taught as a set of rules that you just have to follow, I think is unfortunate, because it means that if you do it wrong, you feel like you're in a very constrained place and that you can't express yourself and that you can't use any of those human qualities like intuition and feelings and emotions. And if you're then told you're wrong a lot, I mean, children, if they put down an answer to a math question, they put it down because they think it's right. But most people don't deliberately put down a wrong answer. So if you put down something that you think is right and you're told it's wrong, then that's kind of scary. It's like not knowing when you're breaking a law and about to be arrested. I mean, it's not quite as extreme as that, but it's a bit like that. And so it will turn people off and make them want to do something where there's more leeway and where they can express themselves more. And as a result, it can seem difficult because it's one of the only subjects where it's really possible to be completely wrong. It's like there's a cliff edge right in front of you all the time. But I hope I've put up some safety nets and some fences to help make it seem less dangerous.
What's the best recipe in the book?
Oh, well, one of my favorites is definitely the conference chocolate cake. And I really invented this at a conference when everyone had piled into my apartment. We were a little bit merry after the conference dinner, and everyone said, "Ooh, make us some dessert." And so the point about this recipe is that if you understand the principles of baking things, then you can more easily make something up under circumstances that are a little bit not the normal ones. For example, that you didn't have a chance to go out and do any shopping. You were taken by surprise. You're a little bit merry after a dinner. And if you understand things like, oh, there's a basic principle, which is that most people find chocolate entirely delicious. And so if you make it chocolatey enough and distract people by some oozing chocolate out of the middle of your cake, then everything will be fine. So I like that one because it reminds me of my mathematician friends and a conference and combining math and food in a real situation.
Listeners, learn how to make chocolate conference cake by reading How to Bake Pie, an edible exploration of the mathematics of mathematics by Eugenia Cheng. Eugenia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
John Williams joins me now with a burning question from our readers/listeners/followers on Twitter. Hi, John.
Hi, Pamela.
We've just started a new thing where we are soliciting questions for the editors here from you. So if you have a question, you can email us at books@nytimes.com or tweet at us or somehow track us down, and we will try to answer on the podcast. What's the question this week, John?
Yeah, we're prompting people during the week on Twitter, so look out there too, and you can reply to our tweets with your questions. This week, a listener/reader/Twitter follower named Alex Blackwell asks, what is the New York Times Book Review's policy on reviews of books embargoed for publication? And maybe first we should explain to people what embargo means.
Let's do that. So an embargo is when publishers do not make advanced reading copies available to reviewers, to the media. This is done often with a big-time novelist coming out with a new book, whether it's J.K. Rowling.
Harper
Lee. That one's a little hard to track down. Or it happens with a nonfiction book that has a lot of news-breaking information, and so it's not made available until the day of publication. Now, the Daily Book Review will, with their incredible investigative skills, often track down an early copy and get a review out there right away in the paper if they decide that the book merits coverage. What we do at the Book Review is with a book like that, we know that we're not going to be able to report immediately on the news, and that others at the newspaper, whether it's the Daily Critic or a reporter covering a beat that might be in the feature in the book, whether it's finance or national security, that they're going to write about that first in the New York Times. And so what we can do at the Book Review is a bit different, which is to follow up with a sort of longer take, a considered take in which we offer a different perspective and maybe do a deeper dive into the book because we're not working on a 24-hour deadline. So that's generally what we do with the Book Review with embargoed books.
Are there any examples you can think of times when we would break an embargo, or are we
We might break an embargo if the embargo has already been broken. So if the book has gone out there and there are already reviews and we do happen to have our review ready to run, then we will follow up with our own review just to take advantage of that sort of heightened interest from potential readers.
Yeah, that's always the risk of an embargo for publishers is once that first person sort of breaks the tape, everybody just rushes in and then all bets are off.
All right, stump us with another question and we will try to answer next week. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pamela. And again, readers can reach us if they want to email at books@nytimes.com or on Twitter. Our handle is @nytimesbooks.
Greg Cowles joins us now with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
Lots of new things on the list.
Especially on the fiction side of things, there are. Starting down at number 15, Jason Matthews, who has been an officer in the CIA, has written a follow-up to his book, Red Sparrow, about a CIA operative. This book is called Palace of Treason.
These books sound so good, I have to say.
It's an insider look at the CIA, new at number 15. Then at number 11, Jeff Shara concludes his quartet of Civil War novels with a book called The Fateful Lightning, new at number 11. This one looks obviously at the end of the Civil War, including Sherman's March. It takes you through the final months of the war. Then at number 4, Judy Blume is back with her fourth adult book. It's called In the Unlikely Event, new at number 4. And finally, new at number 1, Stephen King has his second detective novel, a follow-up to Mr. Mercedes, featuring some of the same characters. This book is called Finders Keepers, and it debuts right at the top of the list.
And speaking of the top of the list, the nonfiction side?
Yeah, very high debuts over in nonfiction. Starting at number 3, a book by, I believe, an academic anthropologist.
An alleged academic anthropologist.
Is that right?
Yeah, she studied comp lit and I think took some anthro courses. But do continue.
Bit of comp lit going on here. The author's name is Wednesday Martin, and her book is called Primates of Park Avenue. It's a look at life on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where she herself lives, and she posits that this entire kind of primate culture that she's on the outs with.
I think our official summary here is a memoir in the satirical guise of an anthropological study.
There you go.
All right. And now something much more truthful.
Well, allegedly truthful. New at number 2, Ann Coulter, the conservative political commentator, has a book called Adios America that's basically a diatribe against immigration and against people who are in favor of immigration. It's funny, Ann Coulter has at times in her career allied herself, said that she sees herself very much in the vein of Clare Boothe Luce, the old conservative congresswoman from Connecticut and publisher. It came up with the idea for Life magazine. She was married, of course, to Harry Luce. And Clare Boothe Luce, despite being a conservative, was very pro-immigration. And she really kind of took a stance against laws that limited the number of immigrants who could come in and was kind of vitriolic against people who favored the white race.
But also apparently quite a charmer.
Ann Coulter departing from her heroine in this book.
All right, then. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.